Thank you very much. So thank you, Vanessa. Thank you, Patsy. It's great to be back. And it's always good to continue these collaborations, ongoing collaborations. Our work kind of takes different directions, but there's always a thread which continues to be the same. What I'd like to focus on today is, it says in my title, the case of contemporary Brazil. But I'm not actually going to focus on what's happening in Brazil, because it makes me very sad. But I'm going to use what's happening in Brazil so that we can understand perhaps something wider, right? Something which I think you found out yesterday, you people, that it was a close miss, right? Yeah. So I'm going to walk ourselves through my take on decolonial theory to understand situations like this. So I'm going to frame it in decolonial theory. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with this, but decolonial theory is theory, though it's used in the singular, it's theories produced by various people. And this is my reading of decolonial theory, so I take full responsibility here for whatever I say about it. But I'd like to begin by focusing on two concepts which come out of two groups of decolonial theory. One group which is comes out of Portugal, which they call Southern epistemologies, or epistemologies of the South, and one group which comes out of Latin North America. So this particular group, the first particular group, focuses on something which they call coloniality, which is the basically this idea that colonization on contact with native others, organized races, languages, knowledges, and I'd say beings, in a hierarchy based on two groups, those that had value and those that did not have value. This hierarchy is referred to as a coloniality of knowledge or coloniality of being. So even though colonization has ended, coloniality persists. So the concept, the word coloniality as opposed to colonization, is used to refer to the long-lasting effects of colonization. Okay? Otherwise, it's very easy to assume that we are no longer colonized. Colonization ended a long time ago, and we are not suffering the effects of it. Now, the other concept, which is the abyssal line, proposed by Souza Santos, is very similar. And in fact, both of these concepts, I would trace their genealogy to the work of Frantz Fanon, as I'll come to that in a moment. But the abyssal line, which Souza Santos describes it, is a line that separates and establishes a system of visible and invisible distinctions. A line that separates social reality into two parts, this side and the other side. Simple as that. All that is on the other side, races, languages, knowledges, beings of any kind, non-human, is deemed to have lesser value and is produced as invisible. So they are not invisible, they are produced as invisible. The line itself is produced as inexistent, invisible, and natural. And for this reason, it's difficult to treat it with the critique that it deserves, because it's difficult for us to see it there. So coloniality and the abyssal line produce what all of these theories call modernity as a privileged condition and science as its privileged product. So modernity is a product and goes together with capitalism as the privileged conditions, and science is the daughter of modernity. Right? This means, as you may know, European modernity was a reaction to tradition, European tradition. Any kind of modernity is a kind of rupture with previous tradition, right? But we tend to talk about modernity and we lose the qualifier European modernity, and that becomes a problem. So we think there is only one modernity, right? So any rupture with previous tradition is a modernity. I'm simplifying this here, but in the case of Europe, it coincided with the colonization of various parts of the world, coincided with the rise of capitalism. So they produce homogeneity as visible and natural, and they produce heterogeneity as invisible and non-existent, right? So at a certain level, they recognize that heterogeneity is there, but they produce it as invisible, so it becomes inaccessible to them, so they don't even have to think about it. They institute separability, that is a focus on the parts and not the whole. The parts are focused on in isolation from the whole, and the scientific method, right? So if we say the scientific method is basically analytic and synthetic, so to analyze something, it takes things apart and brings them together. So we may say that, but this has got nothing to do with the separability that we've learned from modernity. It has everything to do with it, because the scientific method, in order to take things apart to analyze them, it first isolates that phenomenon from the whole, right? And then it takes apart and puts together the little item that it has already separated from the whole. So the putting together of science is not the same as the putting together of the whole, okay? So abyssal thinking as epistemic racism, which is what Ramon Groth-Vogel, particularly the term that he uses, epistemic racism. But I'd say it's more than epistemic, it's ontological, okay? So here's what Frantz Fanon, who I'd mentioned previously, proposed. He says, though racism is thought to work on the sole basis of skin color, it seems to work more complexly along the line of the human and divides the world into a zone of being, people by beings of maximum humanity and worth, and a zone of non-being, people by beings of minimal or inexistent humanity and worth. So you can see modernity at work here, dividing the world into two, breaking down, separating the two. The other part becomes invisible, so the separation is forgotten. So this brings us to the idea of racialization, because here we are talking about a separation based on humanity and worth, not on skin color. But then it becomes race, so that's why it's use the term here, racialization. So racialization from the perspective of epistemologies of the South involves the marking not only of bodies, but also of knowledges, cultures, languages, and even the planet, right? Because what happens, all our concerns about the planet and climate change and whatever are put into the zone of non-being, so we don't even have to think about it, right? We produce this as non-existent, as invisible. So those from the zone of being are marked, racialized, deviant, the zone of non-being, sorry, are marked, racialized, and deviant. They are not the norm, and seen as inferior, having lesser worth, whereas those from the zone of being are unmarked and seen as the norm. Racialization thus produces the invisibility of bodies, knowledges, cultures, languages, and again, the planet, and reinforces separability, atomization, and a loss of interconnectedness. So when we see anything in terms of a hierarchy or being separated along a division of a line, imaginary or not, we are talking about separability. We are talking about a loss of the perception and importance of the whole and how we are interconnected and related. Okay, so again, to going further into this idea of epistemic racism, this is what Ramon Groth-Vogel proposes. He says, the Western subject sees herself as a full citizen in undeniable possession of a language, culture, knowledge of undeniable value. Remember, the Western subject is on this side of the line, right? In contrast, for those located in the shadow of the West, on the other side of the line, in the zone of non-being, the possibility of not being understood, seen, or heard is held as predictable. So obviously we are not going to understand. Remember, they have no worth, so they're not worth understanding, okay? So the whole set of things on the other side of the line, we don't even make an effort to understand. Knowledge naturally is produced from a specific location. It doesn't fall out of the sky. By specific bodies with specific perspectives, meaning specific histories. However, in epistemic racism or abyssal thinking, knowledge does not see itself as emanating from a located, situated point of view, and thus becomes universal. Hence its characterization as an ego politics or body politics of knowledge, which is what this kind of decolonial theory refers to it. Why is it an ego politics of knowledge? Because it sees only this side of the line in which the dominant ego subject is located. So it's an ego politics or body politics because the body that thinks and produces these divisions and this separability makes itself invisible, right? And therefore becomes universal. So it's a politics of making the dominant body invisible and therefore beyond critique. So this partial knowledge, separated from the interconnected whole, sees and sells itself as an independent whole. See the paradox? The part becomes the whole. It is in this way that modernity, through coloniality and the abyssal line, impose and institute the current paradigm of mastery and progress and development. The two characteristics of our present paradigm: mastery, so we know power, and progress and development. The concept of the teleological line of time, we're always moving forward. Primitive is whatever's left behind. Advanced, developed is whatever moves forward. All right? And it's as if we know where we are going. Do we? Mm-hmm. So what are exactly the strategies of decolonial critique? In order to make visible the people's knowledges and languages whose experience has been wasted, this is a term used by Souza Santos, wasted because it's not taken into account, it's been produced as invisible, right? Wasted through instituted and learned ignorance. And here I insist on the idea that learned ignorance, meaning we learn not to know certain things, right? This learned ignorance, when it reaches the academy, it also becomes learned ignorance, right? Instituted, privileged ignorance. So decolonial theory proposes to de-universalize and relocalize the knowledges that see themselves as universal and modern by bringing the bodies back into the picture. Remember the ego-body politics of knowledge? So all universal knowledge is knowledge which hides the subjects that produced it. Now we bring what the decolonial critique is to bring these bodies back into the picture and say that these bodies have an origin somewhere. They come from somewhere. They may be human, they may not be human, right? But there are other bodies as well on the other side of the line which have been invisibilized. So when we bring bodies back into the picture, we realize that there's a plethora, a plurality of bodies, right? And which have to be considered in relation to each other. So by attributing bodies to the subjects that produce hegemonic modern knowledge, these subjects can visibly be seen to occupy spaces that are traversed by histories, like other knowledge-producing subjects whose bodies were invisibilized in the abyssal zone of non-being, can then be reconnected and reentangled with these other bodies. Other bodies in terms of post-humanism can be, we may be talking about other non-human bodies, right? So the decolonial strategy of critique starts with an identification of inequality and injustice that has been naturalized in universalized Western or Northern hegemonic epistemologies that we have all inherited and generally are complicit with, especially in the academy, right? We do science, therefore we do, meaning we reproduce, even though we may question it, we start with it, what we call universal knowledge, right? Hence our complicity. The decolonial political or critical strategy is to identify, interrogate coloniality and the abyssal line within our own thinking to begin with, in order to interrupt and go beyond it and promote diversity and cognitive justice. I'll say more about cognitive justice in a moment. The concept of cognitive justice is already a product of modernity because it separates the justice of knowledge and the mind from the justice of the body and other bodies. Okay? So identifying, interrogating and interrupting coloniality involves a process of working through mastery and progress, which instituted separability and partiality in order to reconnect and bring together the knowledges and bodies that had been separated into now an ecology of interconnected knowledges. So, what exactly is this cognitive justice that I've been using without questioning? The Indian thinker Viswanathan says this: cognitive justice refers to the recognition of the existence of a plurality of knowledges and their right to exist. Souza Santos says, modern science lacks the capacity to capture the inexhaustible diversity of the world, right? So hence the concept that I mentioned earlier, his idea of wasted knowledge. So modern science wastes knowledge. It takes into account only certain knowledges, right? So this is the idea that, so cognitive justice would be to take into account the knowledges which have been invisibilized by modernity and science. So both of the above represent a challenge to the claimed universality of science to grasp and inform practices of subjugated knowledges. They represent a shortcoming on the part of universalized science to grasp a plethora of invisibilized sustainable systems and concepts of justice that the current state of the planet demands. It's not a call to replace one set of knowledges with another. So it's not switching the sides of the line, right? Okay, now it's our turn. We were invisibilized by you. Now we will invisibilize you instead. It is a call to make visible previously invisibilized knowledges, a call to identify one's own ignorance, which was produced, learned, an awakening to the possibility of the not known and the not yet knowable, right? It involves going beyond cognitive justice to attain effective relational and ecological justice, which is what the work of Vanessa Andreotti is all about. Okay? Now, this is the framing, the problem. So I'm using the decolonial theory, as I summarized until now, to look at a particular problem that concerns me from the perspective of applied linguistics and language and pedagogy. Firstly, just I have to do this. A quick contextualization of what's happening in Brazil. So since January 2019, an extreme right-wing government takes office in Brazil, supported by three groups: the military, business owners, and the evangelical movement. It has declared itself openly, publicly, against academics and against especially the humanities, which are seen as not being of benefit to society and not profit generating. So our Ministry of Education is in the process, it has been in the past 3 months, of shutting down money for research, funding for research, especially for the humanities. We don't bring profits to our institutions. Right? So all of this is in favor of the hard sciences, which, yes, they are modern, efficient, and profit generating. Now you see here how modernity and the separability is at work, separating knowledge in the university and the academy into atomizing it into different areas. So against education that promotes, it is against education that promotes critique and social justice. You know, our president, or someone's president, is constantly verbalizing this, that he is against education that promotes critique and social justice, right? Which is seen as ideological. This is a term that they use emphatically, ideological. So anyone who defends views that I don't agree with is ideological. Right? Because it discusses why are these people who come from the humanities, meaning teachers, education. So when he's against the humanities, he's against teachers, not just university teachers, teachers in general. Right? Why are they ideological? Because they discuss problems of violence, gender, equality, and homophobia. Right? All of these things as our Minister of Education, somebody's Minister of Education, right, says, we at universities, all we do, everything that we do is immoral. We don't produce knowledge, right? So we promote immorality. We promote a lack of worthwhile knowledge. Now they defend, this is what they've been attacking. Now what do they defend? They defend a Christian education in a secular republic which recognizes in the Constitution a separation between church and state. But they're proposing a Christian model of education. So they are in favor of useful, meaning market-oriented, and efficient, again, market-oriented, profit-guaranteed education that teaches respect and obedience. Especially the military component of the government is pushing for, and if you go onto the website of our Ministry of Education, you'll see proposals for using military schools as a model for our schools. So the new policies promise to put an end to previous educational policy based on the teachings of Paulo Freire, who is now demonized, because his teachings were moved by social justice and instrumentalized by critical pedagogies. All right, so all of these things are now demonized. So I'm going to focus here on the national literacy policy, which came out earlier this year. So the focus of this literacy policy is on the years 1 to 3 of the primary level, so for kids from 6 to 8 years of age. The rationale for producing this specific policy is the data that 20% of children at year 3 were not able to read and write. Now, how they assessed what reading and writing meant, we don't know, okay? And the proposed solution, which is this policy, it's to teach literacy through phonics, to replace literacy as social practice. Right? We're going back to phonics. Phonics, remember, they are against the humanities, in favor of the sciences. The breakdown, the separability. Phonics is seen as modern. We can count letters and sounds. We can talk about graphemes and phonemes, right? So phonics is seen as modern, scientific, and efficient. We can test whether a child has learned the relationship between a letter and a sound. And we can be happy whether something has been learned or not. And we can even fool ourselves into thinking that's reading, right? So phonics is seen as modern, scientific, and efficient, and not wishy-washy social science. The previous focus on literacy as social practice is seen to be time-consuming and inefficient, and blamed for the fact that 20% of our children are not able to read. Okay? So this is the problem that I'm focusing on and that I'm going to use decolonial theory to talk about. But first, let me introduce you to what he's the main coordinator of the literacy policies within our Ministry of Education. And this is what he says, again from an interview which is on the website of the Ministry of Education. He says things like this: the phonics synthetic method is considered the most efficient. It teaches children first the relationship between the graphemes and the phonemes, and then teaches them how to synthesize or bring together these letters and sounds to form words. See how modernity at work here, separability, atomization, that's knowledge. Readers who do this increase brain activity, again, the paradigm of modernity, science, rationality. Readers who do this increase brain activity in the left hemisphere, which prepares the person for reading. The cognitive science of reading, he says, is fed by cognitive neuroscience and leads to a greater efficiency in teaching. So all of the policies is fundamented by data from supposedly cutting-edge research. So what does this do? It draws on modernity and its daughter science. It emphasizes the archetype of modern science, which is separability and not relationality. and the larger context with other contexts. And and not relationality with the larger context and relationality between the larger context and other contexts. Okay? So even when it speaks of synthesizing and bringing together, you see it refers to bringing together separated items to form other larger separated items. So both scales of separation do not attain the larger scale of the wider context or the relations with other contexts. Right? So it's a whole different concept of what reading is all about. But a whole different concept which has political motivations. Right? And it will have planetary consequences. Now, I'm taking this expression, words pregnant with the world, which is one of the expressions of Paulo Freire, right? See what he means. So a pedagogy that's based on a single concept of reality, based on coloniality and the abyssal line, the idea that only these things on this side of the line are worth considering. A pedagogy that does this results in the promotion of mastery and progress and disrespect for diversity. Hi, hi, hi. Hi, Souza. Bom dia. So this form of pedagogy based on a single reality, only on the knowledge of this side of the line, not only erases the role of the learner as social subject, capable of constructing her own knowledge, but also erases the fact that the learner may systemically belong to an other invisibilized reality with other also invisibilized knowledges. Paulo Freire, when discussing the importance of the act of reading, speaks of, as I mentioned before, words pregnant with the world. So he's speaking of an inseparability between words and world. He's speaking against an atomization between language and the world. The written word may thus embody language belonging to one world and not another. So the written word represents one form of knowledge, but there are other forms of knowledge which are not in the written word. Okay? In the process of learning to read, this learner, the learner learning to read, first reads the world before reading the word, not the opposite. Okay? The world of the learner is brought to the learning of the written world. Right? So the focus in the pedagogical process is focus on the world of the learner. That's why the learner is reading the world before the learner is going to learn the new information, which is the writing. The world of the learner is brought to the learning of the written word. The written word is shown to be the place of contact or conflict between the world of the learner and the world of the written word, the culture, the literate culture of modernity and coloniality. The written word is then no longer just a sequence of sounds or letters, but a word pregnant with the world. So we're not just learning graphemes and phonemes, we are learning the world when we learn to read. Now just an example of what this could possibly mean from an example from indigenous literacy in Brazil. This is a particular example from the Chavante community. They talk about, in their schools, messages from the forest. The concept of language in the indigenous Chavante classroom involves learning to understand the genre of messages from the forest, which are messages brought by birds. So the teacher is explaining this to the student, and I quote, "It's a dance that is sung, a dance and a song." See all these different forms of language we are not accustomed to taking into account when we focus on the verbal. It's a dance that is sung, a dance and a song. And he says to the kids, even if you don't understand the language, try to feel the language, because language is also feeling. It is not only about understanding, it is also about feeling. Now imagine yourself, if this teacher, indigenous teacher in an indigenous school is teaching this to indigenous kids, imagine in a mainstream school what sense this would make. right? So local knowledge confuses the mainstream literate school separation between knowing and being, and between knowing as abstract and rational and knowing as embodied and feeling, right? So this is why we can't generalize when we're teaching, we can't universalize when we're teaching kids to read and write. We have to take into account, as Freire always mentioned, the communities, the cultures they are coming from. And Freire does this through his pedagogy. The political aspect of the Freirean pedagogy of literacy is present in the 3 steps Freire proposes for this pedagogy. He says, first, we have to meet with a community of learners and established oral world words, palavras mundo, world words, that are significant for that community. For example, working with a community of a fishing community in the periphery of a large city in the northeast, Recife, the kind of words that came up in this discussion were, in Portuguese, equivalent of tide, boat, fish, net, right? These are world words, because these are words which are extremely important in their world. Okay? So once we establish this, the word significant for that community, we sensitize the learner subjects about the existence of world words in their context and the lexical universe of writing. The example he takes, I'm giving here, is the idea of, in another community, the idea of brick. So how are these words then used? Portuguese can be divided syllabically because we have conjunctions of consonant syllable, consonant syllable. So once you take a word like tijolo in Portuguese, which means brick, then we can, and this is a word which carries meaning for example, an urban community, a marginalized urban community where most of the people are laborers in construction sites, or they build their own houses with leftover bricks, right? So they know the word brick, tijolo, is important to them. Now this word is used as a base word in the pedagogical process. So the word tijolo is broken down into the syllables tijolo. These become generative syllables for the production of other syllables. So you can produce words like which begin with T-I-J-O-L-O at the beginning, at the end, in the middle, right? So what's happening here? We are sensitizing the learners to the denaturalizing of these words. These are not simple words. We want to make them aware of how these words carry their world and what they conceal. This is important because here he's talking about looking at the wider system, right? For example, the brick, labor, building, when they're discussing the word tijolo, brick, what is this connected to? Labor. Most of your parents, most of you, if they're adults, are laborers on building sites. It's connected to building. Now what's this got to do with things like exploitation, the lack of adequate housing, land value, social injustice? All of this is discussed through choosing words pregnant with the world, these words which will be the basis of a process of literacy. So once the words pregnant with the world are established by and for that community of learners, the corresponding written forms of these words are then taught. Now what's happening here? By identifying the coloniality that is persistent in the apparently natural, singular and unchangeable word worlds, the learners learn to interrogate coloniality and learn not only to read but also to interrupt this naturalized, invisibilized coloniality and contribute to transforming their world. So just by looking at the word brick, they're beginning to question the fact they have been marginalized. It's got to do with a wider system that marginalizes them, and the fact that they are not aware of their marginalization or how it's connected to the larger system makes them now aware of it, right? And all of this in the process of reading, right? So The coloniality of the phonic method involves logocentrism and phonocentrism. Logocentrism meaning a single invariable truth, and it refers to the relation of representation, the idea that graphemes represent phonemes, X refers to Y and only to Y. Phonocentrism refers to the primacy attributed to voice. Multimodality and multisemiosis are not accounted for in phonics. Phonocentrism only looks at sound, it doesn't look at feeling, doesn't look at gestures, it doesn't look at facial expressions. So it's an atomization, that separability, atomization of what language could mean. So this phonocentrism and logocentrism is extended to alphabetic writing and produces graphocentrism, the idea that letters are worth more than images, the idea that if you are illiterate, you're worth nothing. Right? At a socio-cultural moment such as ours, dominated by technology, social media and multimedia, and populated by multimodality, to teach reading through phonocentrism and graphocentrism invisibilizes these current means of communication, not to mention others that are yet unknowable to us. It allocates them to the other side of the abyssal line. So by teaching that the relation between letters and sounds, as our policy at present tries to do, is direct and scientific, the conventionality and historicity, and hence variability of this relationship is concealed. The complexity, the interconnectedness of the relationship is simply concealed. An example, the Portuguese language, both referring to the Portuguese of Brazil and the Portuguese of Portugal. Portuguese has undergone 10 orthographic changes between the years 1885 and 2009, which is when they were abandoned. Right? 10 orthographic changes. So how can you teach kids that the meaning is in, the sound is in the letter? If you're in your own language, that relationship alters with time. The fact that such conventions tend to be imposed and normatized top-down in unequal relations of power is concealed. By devaluing literacy as social practice, phonic methods conceal the perception of the systemic restrictions and affordances on the learner as a socio-historic subject, and hence erase agency. By doing so, they naturalize the existing coloniality and the abyssal line which permeate written culture. So our present policy is to undo all of the social justice that was attained in the last 20 years at least, right? And to keep people in place, erase agency. So just as they promote the naturality of the relation between letter and sound, phonic methods promote the maintenance of the established status quo as fixed and natural. A focus on literacy as a social practice, on the other hand, promotes the role of the reader as a social subject, as we know. It opens up for critique the conventionality and hence variability of the relation between letters and sounds mediated by readers as social subjects. A pedagogy of literacy as social practice promotes the need for constant critical analysis and action. Promotes this identifying constantly the coloniality, interrogating it, interrupting it. Critique here, and it's important here when I say critical analysis and action. Critique here is not based on a right-wrong dichotomy. This is Souza Santos speaking. Critique here is not based on a right-wrong dichotomy, but on the post-abyssal line and post-coloniality possibility of, meaning after we eliminate the abyssal line, after and if we eliminate the abyssal line and coloniality, the possibility of the unleashing of a plural and diverse ecology of knowledges. Here critique involves the action of listening to oneself listening and reading oneself read. So when I'm listening to myself listening, I'm focusing on what is it that does not permit me to understand certain things and focuses me on only seeing certain things or understanding certain things. Then I can understand how systemically I have been taught, I have learned a particular ignorance. Okay? So how do coloniality and the abyssal line affect my understanding? It involves asking, why did I understand what I understood, and why did I not understand what I didn't understand? It involves acting on the knowledges acquired through this process. So it's identifying, interrogating, and interrupting. Though phonics may be useful at certain stages of literacy teaching for facilitating comprehension or difficulties of specific aspects and specific learners, it may cause harm as a generalized pedagogy of literacy, given that words are not just groupings of sounds or letters, but are pregnant with the world. So, concluding, I'm gesturing towards the pedagogy of post-abyssal thinking. So, what does this mean? It means to think from the perspective of the unthought on the other side of the line. Precisely because the other side of the line has been the realm of the unthinkable in Western modernity. Two things. It's the realm, the other side of the line, the invisibilized other side of the line, the zone of non-being. It is the unthought, right? But there, on the other side of the line, besides the unthought, there is also what we have not yet learned to think, right? So the post-abyssal thinking is learning from the metaphoric south. South here is not a geographical south. We can have a south in the north, right? Post-abyssal thinking is learning from the metaphoric south through an other epistemology, ontology. It confronts the monoculture of modern science with a plurality of an ecology of knowledges. It's an ecology because it is based on the recognition of the plurality of heterogeneous knowledges and on the sustained and dynamic non-hierarchical interconnections between them. So knowledge here is interknowledge. It's not singularity. It's a plurality of knowledges, so we're talking about interconnections between knowledges. Interknowledge requires a focused stance towards overcoming separability, mastery, and progress. So separability here is the atomization of different knowledges, eradicating, invisibilizing some. Mastery is understanding knowledge as something through which we progress and we learn more, but we only learn more knowledges on this side of the line. We are not learning anything about what we have invisibilized. And progress is this idea we are becoming more developed on one side of the line. So we are ignoring the other side. So how developed is this? So this may be achieved through a focus on translation. Not translation as transferal or completeness, not the idea that we are going from one meaning to another, but translation as an ethical attitude. Given that all knowledges are incomplete, this is the ethical attitude. Given that all knowledges are incomplete and constituted by ignorance, and without ignorance there can be no knowledge, and total knowledge implies ignorance of its own ignorance. Okay? Translation, the ethical attitude of translation involves situated subjects, human or not. Situated meaning they have bodies, they have a history, they come from a particular systemic interconnectedness. Translation involves situated subjects, human or not, unceasingly negotiating between knowledges, aware constantly of how their own ignorance and that of others affects what they understand at a particular moment. And I end there. Thank you very much.